Is Hans Niemann a fake natty? Now, if you're not familiar with the term fake natty, it's usually borrowed from the weightlifting community, bodybuilding, and so forth. A fake natty is somebody that uses steroids but tells everybody that they don't. The idea natty being short for natural. They act like they're natural, but they're really cheating. Is Hans Niemann a fake natty? Well, it's a good question, not to get into whether or not he's cheated in certain games in the past or not, but is he a high-level grandmaster on his own, or did he need computers to get to that level? Well, Fabiano Caruana recently spoke to this, and Caruana said there is no doubt in his mind that Hans Niemann, his level of high 2600, low 2700, is legit. He really is that good. He really is a genuine grandmaster, whether he cheated at certain points or not. He is a legit GM. And this game from the U.S. Championship, I think, speaks to that a little bit. White was played by Elshan, Moradiabadi, and Hans Niemann has the black pieces. Let's jump right in and take a look. Moradiabadi plays d4, knight f6, knight f3, g6, c4, bishop to g7. So Hans Niemann plays the King's Indian defense. This is what you play when you want to win. That means he's playing for a win, not to equalize out of the opening. Knight to c3, castles, and bishop to g5. The Smyslov system is played by Moradiabadi. The idea behind this is basically to keep black from having any fun, to remove all of the targets, and makes it almost impossible for black to play e5 because then there'd be a pin on this diagonal. So he's trying to contain Hans Niemann's position. So Hans plays c5. That's the most common way to deal with the King's Indian or the Smyslov system because this bishop is at g5, and that leaves this b2 pawn a little sensitive, so you want to open up this long diagonal by playing c5, d5, d6, and e3. E4 may look like a better move, but that's just another target for black. It's playable, nothing wrong with it, but the whole idea of the Smyslov system is to not create targets, so I give him one. After h6, queen to a5, the knight on c3 is pinned, the pawn is threatened. Black is beginning to enjoy himself a little too much. So white plays e3, knight b to d7, and bishop to e2. Same thing. Bishop to d3 is a more aggressive posting, but after knight to g4, the knight can go to e5, hitting the bishop. Why give him a target? So instead, Moradiabadi plays bishop to e2, h6, bishop h4, g5, bishop to g3, and knight to h5. Going after the advantage of the two bishops, but he does loosen his own king a little bit, and he's got to be careful. He doesn't want to take that bishop and open up the h-file for white, and to that point, white immediately plays queen to c2. Now that doesn't look like much, but it actually contains a pretty nasty threat. The idea is that the rook at h1 and the queen at c2 could actually meet at h7, and you're saying, well, all this stuff is in the way. How's that going to happen? Well, because white is threatening to play knight to g5, which unveils an attack on the knight. In order to not lose a piece, black would have to take on g3, but then after you take that pawn, pawn takes knight, boom, queen to h7 mate. So queen to c2 actually threatens knight to takes g5. So Niemann plays knight d to f6. Defends the knight on h5, also covers h7 for the time being. The knight goes to d2, opens up some pressure against the knight. Now a6. Hans Niemann wants to expand on the queen side. a4 to keep b5 from being played. A lot of times black will play b5 even if it means giving up a pawn just to open up lines. Bishop to d7 attacks b5, and now a5. This was a novelty before the move castling had been played, but he plays a5. The idea is to sort of clamp down on the b6 square. There is a downside to this move, though, and that is if black can still advance on the queen side, there will be more weaknesses for him to target. This actually allows black, if he plays b6, to open up lines later. Rook goes to b8 for that exact purpose. Castles, and now that the h-file doesn't have the rook on it, Hans Niemann goes ahead and takes the bishop. He doesn't have to worry about that rook at h1 being opened up. hg3, and now knight to g4. And one of the strategies here in the Smyslov, and it's a strange one because it doesn't exist in many openings, is to play f5 and then queen e8, and then move the queen to g6 or to h5. That's sort of the natural strategy. Queen to d1. Now the knight's being attacked twice, so black has to do something, so he plays that move f5 to defend it a second time. e4 tries to undermine the defense of that knight, so the knight does move to e5. pawn takes, bishop takes f5. So here we see black has very active bishops. Very active bishops. Now white has more space and a safer king. Black's king could get in a bit of trouble, but in terms of piece activity, Hans Niemann can be very happy here. The knight to f3 to challenge the knight. Now queen to e8 to shift over the queen. Knight takes e5, bishop e5. Now he has the two bishops for the moment, but white plays bishop to h5. That hits that queen and sort of irritates all these open light squares around black's king. And so Hans Niemann says, I'll tell you what, I want to trade that off. I'll give up the two bishops, but your light squared bishop will come off the board, so they trade, and the queen goes to g6. White still has his central space, but black can get activity on either side of the board, on the b file or on the king side. The queen goes to e2, rook to f7, perhaps preparing to double and attack the f2 square. Knight to e4 has a little threat of knight takes c5. If the pawn were to take the knight, the bishop at e5 would hang. So bishop to d4 is played to prevent that threat. And now f2 is sort of black's new target. The bishop and the two rooks can come in and put a lot of pressure on that square. The rook comes to a3. He wants to bring the rook to f3, challenge that rook, and trade down the f-file to remove the pressure. So Hans Niemann plays g4, controlling the f3 square. The rook can't move there now. Rook to d3 was played. He could play rook to b3, aiming at b7 and sort of locking down this rook, so it makes it hard for it to move. But instead he plays rook to d3, and the idea is to play b4. The pawn cannot take the pawn because the bishop at d4 would hang. Rook to f5 was played by Hans Niemann. Another good move was b6, and the idea of just opening up that queen side. That would have been good for black as well. Rook to f5, now queen to d2. Again, just prepping this b4 move to undermine the bishop at d4. Rook b to f8, and now b4 comes. Obviously, he can't take because rook takes d4 would just win the bishop. So he plays rook to e5. Now he's attacking the knight twice. Pawn takes, and I mean, if he can't take the knight because the bishop would fall, and that would be a bad trade. So pawn takes, and now he could play knight to c3, but instead, Moradiabadi, I think, makes the best decision. He plays rook takes bishop, pawn takes rook, and then knight to c5. He's giving up an exchange, it's true, but this knight becomes a monster after knight to c5. It's attacking b7. There's a fork threatened on d7. It would fork the two rooks. And the e6 square is just a beautiful square on its own. Then I could just sit there and cause all kinds of trouble for black. So here, in fact, queen to f5, hitting that d7 square was probably the best, but he plays rook e to f5. That also steps out of the fork and continues the attack on the f2 pawn. And now queen takes d4. So white does have a pawn for the exchange and this very powerful knight. White's doing pretty well here, actually. But Hans Niemann still has lots of kingside pressure. He begins the advance of the h-pawn. Knight to e6 comes in. What if he just grabs that pawn that's just sitting there? Well, then, after h4, black is generating a lot of pressure. And after, say, a pawn takes g3, and there's a pin on the f2 pawn, he'd be in some trouble. If he plays queen to e3, just queen to h5, and black is doing better. So instead he plays knight to e6. The rook goes to f6. The knight goes to f4. That hits the queen. So the queen moves back to h7. It's not being attacked. It also supports the advance of this h-pawn, continuing that pressure. Now, here, Moradiabadi decides to play queen to a7. Another good idea would have been, in fact, a better idea, would have been to play c5, keep the queen centralized, and to begin to move those central pawns forward towards the queening square. Queen to e7 threatens a lot of stuff. It threatens a check. It threatens the b7 pawn. The problem is it gets a little bit too far removed from this king, and that allows Hans Niemann to generate some real pressure. h4, and here Moradiabadi goes ahead and takes that pawn, and that's a little too much, and it allows a brilliant, brilliant tactic from Hans Niemann. First, he takes on g3, and here the pawn retakes. If he plays queen to c8 check, king to f7, then takes, after rook to h6, black still has a very strong attack, threatening rook to h1 and all kinds of trouble in white's position. But he takes here, and this allows a bolt from the blue. I'll give you a second if you can see it from black. That's right, this amazing move, E5. So there's a lot going on here. First of all, this knight is pinned by these rooks. Second, it reveals the queen attacking the B7 queen. And because that's the case, white doesn't have enough time to take the E5 pawn en passant. And if he takes the queen, king takes, then the pin remains. If he plays queen to C8 check, then you just block it, then queen to E6 check, but then just queen to F7. And then after exchange of queens, the pin still remains. And because of that, after E5, Moradiabadi resigned. A brilliant game. Now, even after this great game from Hans Niemann, there is still some great chess you're missing out on to fix that problem. Believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to look at is in this video right here. So make sure to check that out next for some really great chess.